The damage counter on the wall hit $498,240,000 at exactly 2:47 a.m. Robert Sterling watched the numbers climb with the detached fascination of a man watching his own funeral. The holographic globe at the center of the Alpha server room, what his engineers affectionately called the ether core, pulsed an angry arterial red. Each pulse represented another container ship rerouted to the wrong continent, another ton of fresh produce rotting in a port 3,000 miles from its destination, another hospital running low on critical medications. This is how empires fall, Rob thought. Not with a bang, but with a software glitch. Behind him, through the glass walls of the adjacent conference room, 20 of the most expensive engineers in North America were screaming at each other. He could see Dr. Heinrich Miller, the German systems architect they'd flown in from Munich at $50,000 per day, jabbing his finger at a whiteboard covered in incomprehensible diagrams. Across from him, Yuki Tanaka from their Tokyo division was shaking her head so violently her glasses nearly flew off. "It's a kernel panic cascading through the routing subroutines," Heinrich shouted, his voice muffled by the soundproof glass. No. The kernel is fine. It's a syntax error in the timestamp validation," Yuki fired back. Rob turned away. He'd stopped understanding their arguments 3 hours ago. All he knew was that his company, the logistics backbone for 40% of North American supply chains, was bleeding out on the operating table, and his surgeons couldn't agree on where the wound was. His phone buzzed. The board was calling again. He answered on the third ring, already knowing what was coming. "Robert." The voice belonged to Marcus Thorne, chairman of the board, a man who had never worked a day in operations but had somehow accumulated enough shares to make Rob's life miserable. "I'm looking at the damage projections. $500 million in one night." "I'm aware, Marcus. The board has convened an emergency session. You have 48 hours to stabilize the system." A pause heavy with unspoken threats. "If you fail, we're initiating Article 7. Article 7, forced resignation and asset liquidation. The corporate equivalent of a public execution." "I understand," Rob said, and hung up before Marcus could add any more conditions. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching the ether core pulse its distress signal into the darkness. Somewhere out there, a mother was waiting for her child's insulin. A grocery store was about to throw away a shipping container of fresh vegetables. A factory was shutting down because its raw materials were currently circling the Pacific Ocean on a ship that thought it was heading to Rotterdam. $500 million, Rob thought, and counting. He didn't notice when the cleaning lady arrived. All Vance had been invisible for exactly 4 years, 7 months, and 13 days. She pushed her gray cleaning cart through the security checkpoint at 2:52 a.m. Her badge read Janitorial Services Night Shift in faded letters. The guard barely glanced at her. Why would he? She was part of the furniture, a necessary piece of the building's ecosystem, like the air conditioning or the emergency lighting. "Just blend in," she reminded herself. "You don't exist. You're just the woman who makes the floor shine." Her uniform was deliberately oversized, a shapeless blue coverall that swallowed her frame and made it impossible to guess her age or figure. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, hidden under a hairnet that had seen better days. No makeup, no jewelry, nothing that might draw attention. The Alpha server room was her last stop of the night, and usually her favorite. She liked the hum of the machines, the soft blue glow of countless LEDs blinking in synchronized patterns. It reminded her of stars, of the physics textbooks still stacked in her tiny apartment, dog-eared and annotated in 3 languages. Tonight, though, the room felt wrong. The globe was red, the air tasted like ozone and panic. And through the glass, she could see the engineers still arguing, their faces twisted with frustration and fear. She began her routine. Mop the floors, wipe down the surfaces, empty the trash cans overflowing with coffee cups and energy drink cans. The detritus of desperate men and women throwing everything they had at a problem they couldn't solve. That's when she saw it. The main terminal, the one Dr. Miller had been using before he stormed off to join the shouting match, was still active. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, a waterfall of logic that most people would see as meaningless symbols. All saw music. She stopped mopping. Her hands, rough from years of manual labor, tightened on the handle as her eyes traced the algorithm. It was a traveling salesman problem variant, the mathematical challenge of finding the most efficient route between multiple points. Logistics companies lived and died by their TSP solutions, and this one was choking. There, she thought, her mind racing ahead of the scrolling code. The timestamp validation. They're using UTC plus 0 as the base, but the Pacific routing nodes are reporting in local time. The conversion is creating a loop. It was such a small thing, a formatting inconsistency that any of those 20 experts should have caught in the first 5 minutes. But they were too busy looking for catastrophic failures, exotic bugs, malicious code, hardware malfunctions. They were thinking like surgeons when they needed to think like mechanics. The system didn't need a transplant. It just needed someone to tighten a loose screw. All glanced toward the conference room. The engineers were still arguing. No one was watching. Don't, a voice whispered in her head. The voice of reason. The voice of survival. You're nobody, you're invisible. If they catch you touching that terminal, you lose this job. You lose your apartment. You lose everything. But another voice was louder. The voice of a woman who had once presented her doctoral thesis to a room full of Nobel laureates, the voice that had been silenced by circumstance, but never quite extinguished. You can fix this. You're the only one who can. She set down the mop. Her fingers found the keyboard with the muscle memory of a concert pianist. She didn't rewrite the code. That would take hours and leave a trail. Instead, she navigated to a buried subroutine, a checkpoint validation function that nobody had touched since the system's initial deployment. One variable, that's all it took. She changed false to true. The effect was instantaneous. The globe at the center of the room flickered. Red became amber. Amber became blue. The cascading error stopped. The damage counter froze at $498,247,091. For a moment, all allowed herself to breathe. Then she heard the beep of a key card at the door. In one fluid motion, she was back in character. Just a cleaning lady scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the tile floor. The security guard who entered gave her a cursory glance and continued his rounds, tapping notes into his tablet. She finished her shift, clocked out at 4:15 a.m., walked to the bus stop 3 blocks away, where she waited 40 minutes in the pre-dawn cold because the route that served her neighborhood only ran once an hour. The bus was nearly empty. A young man in hospital scrubs dozed against the window. An elderly woman clutched a bag of groceries to her chest like a lifeline. Nobody looked at anybody. Nobody ever did. She was invisible. And tonight, she had saved the world. Robert Sterling was the son of a steel worker and a kindergarten teacher from Youngstown, Ohio. He built Ether Dynamics from nothing, a one-room startup in his mother's basement that grew into a logistics empire worth $12 billion. He'd survived 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and a divorce that had cost him half his net worth and all of his faith in human nature. None of that had prepared him for this morning. He stood in his office, coffee growing cold in his hand, staring at the dashboard on his wall. Green across the board, system efficiency up 200%. Damage containment successful. The ether core was humming along as if nothing had ever happened. "We had a breakthrough last night," Dr. Miller said, standing in the doorway with the look of a man who had just witnessed a miracle and was trying to take credit for it. A collaborative effort. The team really came together. Rob set down his coffee. A breakthrough. Yes, around 3 a.m., we isolated the timestamp discrepancy in Henrik. Rob's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a man who had built an empire by knowing when people were lying to him. "I watched you argue with Yuki Tanaka for 6 hours about kernel panics. You didn't solve anything." The German's face went pale. "Sir, I assure you." "Get out." Henrik got out. Alone in his office, Rob pulled up the system logs. He'd learned to code before he learned to read financial statements, and old habits died hard. The terminal showed the standard access records. Dr. Miller at 11:47 p.m., Yuki Tanaka at 12:33 a.m., various other engineers throughout the night. And then at 2:58 a.m., a single entry that made his blood run cold. User, admin_ghost. Action, variable modification. Location, checkpoint, _validation, _subroutine. Change, false to true, admin_ghost. A generic system ID that shouldn't have been active on any human terminal. Someone had accessed his system, made a surgical change, and vanished without a trace. Industrial espionage, Rob thought immediately. A competitor gaining access, fixing the problem to study the vulnerability, planning to exploit it later. It was the only explanation that made sense. He pulled up the security footage from the Alpha server room. The timestamp read 2:57 a.m. The engineers were in the conference room arguing. The main floor was empty, except for one figure. Rob leaned closer to the screen. A cleaning lady. She was mopping the floor near the central terminal. Ordinary, forgettable, the kind of person your eyes slid past without registering. But as he watched, something changed. Her posture shifted. The hunched shuffle of a tired worker became the focused stillness of a predator. He watched her set down her mop, watched her fingers fly across the keyboard with a speed and precision that made his breath catch. Watched her navigate through layers of code that his senior engineers couldn't understand, find the exact subroutine that was causing the cascade, and fix it. 4 minutes from start to finish. It took her 4 minutes, and then she went back to mopping the floor. Rob rewound the footage, watched it again and again. The third time through, he paused on her face as she worked at the terminal. Her expression was transcendent. There was no other word for it. Her eyes were bright, her lips slightly parted, her entire being focused on the screen with an intensity that reminded him of artists at their easels or musicians in the grip of a symphony. Who the hell are you, he thought. He pulled her personnel file. All Vance, age 34, hired 18 months ago through a temp agency. No educational background listed. No previous employment history beyond various service positions. Emergency contact, none. Next of kin, none. A ghost in human form. Rob closed the file and reached for his phone. Then he stopped. If he reported this, security would detain her. HR would fire her. Legal would sue her for unauthorized system access. The 20 engineers who couldn't solve the problem would spend the next 6 months convincing themselves that she had actually made things worse, that their collaborative breakthrough was the real solution, and he would never know how a cleaning lady became a better systems architect than 20 PhDs. Instead of calling security, Rob checked the night shift schedule. All Vance was due back in 12 hours. He would be waiting. District 4, called the Rust by locals who remembered when the steel mills still operated, was the kind of neighborhood that appeared on city maps as a blank space. Not dangerous enough to warrant police attention, not prosperous enough to attract development, just forgotten. All's apartment was on the 5th floor of a building that predated air conditioning and fire codes. The elevator hadn't worked since the Reagan administration. The hallway lights flickered with the rhythm of a dying heartbeat. But her unit was clean, warm, and filled with the only treasures she had left. Books. They lined every wall, stacked 2 and 3 deep on shelves she'd built from scavenged wood. Hawking and Penrose on cosmology, Knuth on algorithms, Shannon on information theory. Feynman's lectures, so annotated that the margins contained more text than the original pages. And on the small table by the window, in a frame she'd found at a thrift store, a photograph. A tiny hand pressed against the glass of an incubator, wires and tubes surrounding a body that weighed less than a bag of sugar. The nameplate at the bottom of the isolette read, Maya Rose Vance, 27 weeks, 1.2 pounds. All touched the frame every morning when she woke and every night before she slept. It was the only ritual she allowed herself. She had just finished changing out of her uniform when she noticed the paper on her door. Notice of eviction property has been acquired by Etherdynamics Corp. All tenants must vacate within 30 days. For information regarding relocation assistance, contact. She read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would change. They didn't. Etherdynamics, the company she had just saved. The company whose $500 million problems she had solved while pretending to clean their floors. They were taking her home to build another server farm, another piece of the machine that was slowly devouring everything she had left. All sank onto her mattress, a queen-sized rectangle that took up most of her tiny bedroom, and stared at the ceiling. This is what you get, she thought. This is what you get for caring, for fixing things that aren't yours to fix, for pretending you're still someone who matters. The universe had a sense of humor, and it was laughing at her. The Alpha server room was quiet when all arrived for her shift that night. Too quiet. The engineers were gone. The conference room was empty. Even the constant hum of the servers seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She pushed her cleaning cart through the door, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. But cleaning ladies didn't listen to instincts. Cleaning ladies pushed their carts and mopped their floors and pretended not to notice when the world was burning around them. Miss Vance, she froze. Robert Sterling was standing by the central terminal, silhouetted against the blue glow of the now peaceful ether core. He looked different from the photos she'd seen in company newsletters, older, more worn, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. "I was hoping we could talk," he said. All's hand tightened on her cart. She glanced toward the door, calculating distances and angles. 20 steps to the exit, but he was between her and the keypad. "Please," Rob continued, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not going to report you. I'm not going to have you arrested. I just want to understand." She didn't move, didn't speak. Rob walked to the main terminal and pulled up a code window, the same subroutine she had modified the night before. "Why a recursive loop?" he asked, pointing to a section of the logic. "The original design used a linear validation." All realized. "He wants to know if I actually understood what I was doing." She remained silent. Rob studied her face. "You can't speak, can you?" The personnel file said nothing about a disability, but he trailed off, then nodded to himself. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." He pulled a wireless keyboard from the desk and held it out to her. "Would this help?" All stared at the keyboard like it was a snake that might bite her. Every survival instinct she'd developed over the past 4 years was screaming at her to maintain the mask, to play dumb, to be invisible. But he had seen her. He knew what she had done. The mask was already broken. She took the keyboard. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a long moment. Then slowly she began to type. The redundancy was strangling the processor. It needed room to breathe. Rob read the words on his tablet, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, he'd already known she was brilliant, but something else, recognition. Maybe the look of a man who had finally found what he was looking for. "Room to breathe," he repeated softly. "That's exactly what I said when I first designed the system. 15 years ago, before the board decided that efficiency meant cramming as many checks as possible into every process." He sat down on the edge of a server rack, his posture suddenly exhausted. "I've spent the last 6 months watching my own creation strangle itself. Every time I try to simplify, Marcus and the board add more layers, more redundancies, more fail-safes that fail." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And then you come along, and in 4 minutes, you see what none of us could." All's fingers moved again. The engineers were looking for a monster. They missed the mouse chewing through the wires. Rob read it and nodded. The monster was me. I built a system too complex for its own good. He looked up at her. "Who are you, Miss Vance? And please don't tell me you're just a cleaning lady." The keyboard sat heavy in her hands. She could lie. She could give him a false name, a fake backstory, the kind of harmless deception that would let her disappear back into anonymity. But she was tired of being invisible. "My name is Alar Vance. I have a PhD in computational physics from MIT. I wrote my dissertation on optimization algorithms for quantum systems. And 4 years ago, I lost everything. My career, my voice, my identity, because I trusted the wrong person." Rob read her words in silence. "Now I clean your floors. And sometimes when no one is watching, I fix your systems. Because I can't help it. Because the code calls to me like music and I have to answer." She set down the keyboard. Her hands were trembling. "My T," Rob said quietly. "Quantum optimization. I read a paper once, must have been 7 or 8 years ago, about applying quantum annealing principles to logistics networks. It was brilliant, ahead of its time. The author's name was..." He stopped. "Vance, Aller Vance." All didn't move. "That was you." She touched her throat, the gesture unconscious and vulnerable, and nodded once. Rob was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more human. "What happened to your voice?" She picked up the keyboard. "There was a fire. My daughter was premature. She needed surgery. I worked 3 jobs to pay for it. One of those jobs was in a chemical plant. There was an accident. The smoke damaged my vocal cords beyond repair." She paused, then added, "She survived. That's all that matters." Rob closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's not enough. I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry." All typed one more line. "The company that employed me at the chemical plant, they paid out a settlement, $47,000. Their lawyer said it was generous. They also owned the temp agency that placed me here." She showed him the screen. The company was a subsidiary of Ether Dynamics. The color drained from Rob's face. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to you, I didn't know." I believe you, but it doesn't change the fact that your company took my voice, and now it's taking my home. She pulled the eviction notice from her pocket and placed it on the terminal. Rob read it. His jaw tightened. District 4. He said the name like a curse. The new server farm. Marcus pushed that through the board while I was dealing with the crisis. I didn't even review the location. It's a residential neighborhood, 300 families. I know. Rob picked up the notice, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. I'll stop it. You can't. The board has already approved the purchase. Watch me. There was something in his voice that made all look up. Not confidence. She'd heard plenty of confident men make empty promises. This was different. This was the quiet determination of someone who had just decided to go to war. The system crash wasn't an accident, Rob said. I've been running diagnostics for months. Someone is sabotaging Ether Core from the inside. The board thinks I'm paranoid, but I know I'm right. And now I have proof. He pulled up a log file on the terminal. Red flags everywhere. Unauthorized access points. Dormant code segments that activated without triggers. Data packets being rerouted through servers that shouldn't exist. Someone wants this company to fail, he continued. They're driving down the stock price, creating crises, positioning themselves for a hostile takeover. And I'm pretty sure I know who. Who? Marcus Thorne, chairman of the board. The man who just gave me 48 hours to fix something that was never broken in the first place. All studied the data on the screen. Her analytical mind was already drawing connections, seeing patterns. The backdoor in the routing algorithm, it's not random. It's triggered by specific conditions. What conditions? She typed rapidly. Temperature fluctuations in the physical servers. When the cooling systems underperform, the backdoor activates. And according to your maintenance logs, the cooling budget for the District 4 data center was cut 6 months ago. Rob's eyes widened. Marcus authorized that cut. He said it was a cost-saving measure. $500 per day in cooling costs. $500 million in damage. That's not incompetence, all typed. That's intent. She looked at him. Someone wanted this to happen. The implications hung in the air between them. Heavy and dangerous. I need your help, Rob said finally. The source of the backdoor is in our Alaska facility, Iron Mountain, the physical servers where our hard backups are stored. If I can prove that Marcus planted the sabotage code, I can stop him. But I can't do it alone. Why me? You have 20 experts. 20 experts who couldn't see a timestamp error. 20 experts who think I'm losing my grip on reality. He met her eyes. You're the only one who sees what I see. All considered the offer. The smart thing would be to refuse, to fade back into invisibility, find another job, another city, another anonymous existence. But she thought about the photograph on her table, the tiny hand pressed against the glass. Maya was 7 years old now. She lived with Ual's sister in Portland, where the schools were better and the air was cleaner. All called every Sunday night, typing messages through a text-to-speech app that never quite captured what she wanted to say. Her daughter didn't remember a time when her mother could sing lullabies. Didn't remember the fire, the hospital, the long months of recovery. That was by design. Some burdens were not meant to be inherited. But if all could help stop the man who was destroying families like hers, families in District 4, families whose homes were being bulldozed for server farms and profit margins, then maybe the invisibility had been worth something after all. She picked up the keyboard. I have conditions. Name them. The families in the District 4, they get relocation assistance. Real assistance, not corporate platitudes. Done. I don't appear on any payroll, no official employment record. I understand you'll be listed as my personal assistant, cash compensation only. And when this is over, you tell the truth about the sabotage, about the cooling, about everything. Rob nodded slowly. Even if it destroys the company, especially then, some things are more important than stock prices. He extended his hand. All hesitated. 4 years since she'd shaken anyone's hand. 4 years since she'd been treated as something more than furniture. She took it. The Gulfstream G650 cut through the Alaskan sky like a silver arrow, leaving Seattle's gray drizzle far behind. At 40,000 feet, the world below was nothing but white. Endless snowfields broken by the dark veins of frozen rivers and the occasional cluster of lights that marked a remote settlement. Rob Sterling sat across from all in the aircraft's leather-appointed cabin, watching her read. The technical manual in her hands was dense with equations and diagrams that would have given his engineering team migraines. but she moved through the pages with the casual ease of someone reading a novel. He found himself studying her face in a way he hadn't allowed himself before. Without the shapeless uniform and the hunched posture of a cleaning lady, she looked different, younger somehow, despite the weariness in her eyes. Her fingers moved across the pages with a pianist's grace, pausing occasionally to trace a particularly complex equation. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked. She looked up, and for a moment he caught something rare in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. She raised her keyboard. "Your documentation team uses too many passive constructions. It makes the logic harder to follow." Rob laughed. A genuine laugh, the first he'd managed in weeks. "I'll be sure to pass that feedback along." She typed again. "Also, Chapter 7 has a fundamental error in the heat dissipation calculations. Your engineers assumed ambient temperature remains constant, but server rooms create microclimates. You found an error in a manual you've been reading for 40 minutes. I've found 7, but the heat dissipation one is the most dangerous. It's why your District 4 servers keep overheating." Rob stared at her. 7 errors in 40 minutes while reading at 30,000 feet. The flight attendant, a young man named Carlos, who had been with the company for 3 years, appeared with coffee and sandwiches. Rob had dismissed the rest of the staff for this trip. The fewer witnesses to his investigation, the better. So it was just the 4 of them, Rob, Carlos, and the 2 pilots in the cockpit. "Anything else, sir?" Carlos asked. "No, thank you. Why don't you take a break? We'll be fine." Carlos nodded and retreated to the small crew cabin near the front of the plane. Rob turned back to All. She was watching the clouds outside the window, her expression distant. "You know," he said, accepting his coffee, "I spent 15 years building this company, worked 18-hour days, missed my son's first steps, his first words, his first day of school." All's attention shifted back to him. "Daniel, he's 23 now, works for a non-profit in Portland, environmental justice, he calls it. He hasn't spoken to me in 2 years." Rob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He says I chose the company over him, over his mother." She picked up her keyboard. "Did you?" The question was blunt, uncomfortable, the kind of question no employee would ever ask a CEO. "I told myself I didn't. I told myself I was doing it for them, building something that would give them security, opportunity, a legacy." He stared into his cup. "Margaret never believed that. My wife, she had MS, diagnosed 6 months after we got married. I told her we'd beat it together, build something that would pay for the best treatments, the best care." All set down her manual completely now, her full attention on him. "The company grew faster than either of us expected. By the time Daniel was 10, Ether was handling logistics for half the West Coast. By the time he was 15, we were the backbone of North American supply chains." Rob's voice grew quieter. "By the time he was 18, Margaret couldn't walk anymore, and I was in Singapore closing a deal that couldn't wait." "When did she die?" 2 years ago. I was in the building when it happened, in a board meeting. My phone was on silent." He set down his coffee, his hands suddenly unsteady. "She died asking for me, and I didn't answer because I was arguing about market share projections with Marcus Thorne." The cabin was quiet except for the hum of the engines. "You lost your voice saving your daughter. I lost my soul saving my company. I'm not sure which of us got the worst deal." All typed slowly, choosing her words carefully. "You built something that matters. Ether Core moves food, medicine, critical supplies. When it works, people live better lives. The problem isn't the machine, it's the people trying to break it. And if I can't stop them, then we build something better." Rob smiled. "You sound like Margaret." She held up a hand, then typed rapidly. "Tell me about Iron Mountain. What are we walking into?" The shift in topic was deliberate, he realized. She was giving him an exit from the emotional conversation, a chance to return to the safety of logistics and strategy. He was grateful. "Iron Mountain is our cold storage facility," he explained, pulling up a map on his tablet, "built into the side of a mountain about 60 miles from Fairbanks. It holds the physical backups for every system Ether operates. Not just digital copies, but the actual server logs, authorization records, everything." "Why physical?" "Digital backups are more efficient." "Because I'm paranoid," Rob admitted, "and because digital records can be altered. Physical records, printed logs, signed documents, hardware authentication keys are much harder to fake." He zoomed in on the facility. "If Marcus planted a backdoor in the system, the authorization trail will be there, along with the original code signatures." And if he's anticipated this, then we're walking into a trap. Rob met her eyes, which is why I need you. You see patterns I miss, connections I overlook. If something's wrong at Iron Mountain, you'll know before I do. She studied him for a long moment. Then she typed, "You're trusting me with a lot. We've known each other for 3 days. You saved my company in 4 minutes. You could have walked away, taken the credit, sold the story to a dozen different outlets. Instead, you went back to mopping floors." He shook his head. "That tells me more about your character than 3 years of interviews ever could. Maybe I'm just a very good actress. Are you?" She held his gaze. Then slowly she shook her head. "Number. I'm terrible at pretending. That's why I became invisible instead." Before Rob could respond, something caught his attention outside the window. The clouds had thickened, swirling in patterns that looked wrong somehow. Unnatural. "That's odd," he murmured. The weather report showed clear skies all the way through. The plane lurched. Coffee flew across the cabin. Alarms blared. The lights flickered, died, came back on emergency red. What the hell? Rob grabbed for his armrest as the aircraft dropped 50 feet in a stomach-turning plunge. The cockpit door burst open. The pilot, a former Navy aviator named Jensen, stumbled out, his face pale. "Sir, we've lost primary systems. The flight computer is cycling through error states I've never seen before." Rob's blood went cold. The flight computer, running on Ether Core 1.0, the version they'd never fully patched after the initial rollout. Marcus, he thought. He knew I'd try to reach Iron Mountain. He's been waiting for this. "Can you fly manual?" he demanded. "I'm trying, sir, but the hydraulics are..." Jensen's explanation was cut off by another violent shudder. "We need to put down now. There's a clearing about 3 miles ahead. It's our only chance." "Do it." The next 2 minutes were an eternity. All had grabbed the armrest beside her. Her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on the window where the ground was rushing up to meet them. She didn't scream. She couldn't. But Rob saw the fear in her face, the same fear that was clawing at his own chest. The plane hit the snow at an angle that wasn't quite right. The world became a kaleidoscope of white and metal and pain. Something struck Rob's leg with an impact that made him cry out. Then everything went dark. Consciousness returned in fragments. Cold. That was the first thing, a cold so profound it seemed to have replaced his blood with ice water. Pain. His left leg was screaming, a sharp agony that cut through the numbness. Silence. No engine noise, no alarms, just the howl of wind against broken metal. Rob opened his eyes. He was still in the cabin, but the cabin was wrong. Tilted at an angle that made his stomach lurch, half buried in snow that had pushed through the shattered windows. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow that made shadows dance like living things. "Jensen!" he called out. His voice was a croak, barely audible even to himself. "Jensen! Carlos!" No answer. He tried to move and nearly blacked out again. His leg was definitely broken. He could see the unnatural angle, even through his torn trousers, the fabric dark with blood that had already begun to freeze. The cold was doing something to his thoughts, making them sluggish and disconnected. He knew he should be panicking. He knew this was a survival situation, that every minute counted, but all he could think about was how quiet it was, how peaceful. "This is how I die," he thought with strange clarity, frozen in a crashed plane in the middle of nowhere. Marcus wins. Margaret's face floated before him. Not the Margaret of her final days, gaunt and tired, but the Margaret of their wedding day, young, hopeful, smiling at him with a future in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he told her. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I..." Movement. Something was moving in the darkness. Rob's survival instincts, dull but not dead, tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A figure, small, quick, moving through the wreckage with purpose. She was alive, battered, yes. He could see blood on her forehead, a dark smear that caught the red emergency light, but alive and moving. She had found the emergency kit and was pulling out thermal blankets, chemical heat packs, anything that might help. She reached Rob and assessed his leg with a clinical eye. Her expression told him everything he needed to know. It was bad, very bad, the kind of bad that required surgery in sterile conditions and trained medical professionals, none of which were available in a crashed plane in the Alaskan wilderness. "Jensen," Rob managed through chattering teeth. "The pilots! Carlos!" All shook her head once, a sharp final motion. Dead. They were alone. The wind outside had picked up. driving snow through every crack and opening in the fuselage with a sound like angry whispers. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his body was starting to shut down. He'd read about hypothermia once in a survival manual he'd kept on his shelf, but never thought he'd need. Stage 1, shivering, pale skin, fast breathing. Stage 2, violent shivering, confusion, drowsiness. Stage 3, shivering stops, pulse slows, unconsciousness. His shivering was already becoming less violent. That was bad. That meant his body was giving up. All wrapped a blanket around him, tucking the edges in with hands that were red from cold but steady. She found a heat pack, cracked it to activate the chemical reaction, and pressed it against his chest. It helped, slightly, but they both knew it wasn't enough. His body had stopped generating its own heat. The blankets were just insulating the cold that was already there. She sat back on her heels, thinking. Her breath came in invisible puffs, and Rob noticed that she was still shivering, which meant she was in better shape than him. She reached for her keyboard. The plastic housing was cracked but still functional. Stay awake. Tell me about your son. The question seemed absurd. He was dying in a crash plane, and she wanted to discuss family relationships. But her eyes were urgent, and he understood. She was trying to keep his brain active, to fight the drowsiness that would lead to unconsciousness that would lead to death. Daniel, he said, the word feeling like sand in his mouth. He's 23, works for a nonprofit, environmental justice. What was he like as a child? Curious, always taking things apart to see how they worked, a ghost of a smile. Drove Margaret crazy. She said he got it from me. Tell me more. He wanted to be an astronaut when he was 7, then a marine biologist, then a programmer. By the time he was 16, he decided the whole system was broken and needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Rob's eyes were growing heavy. He wasn't wrong. The shivering had stopped completely now. That was very bad. All's expression changed, something between determination and dread. She typed rapidly. I know what to do, but you have to trust me. I trust you, Rob said, and meant it. What choice did he have? When my daughter was born, she was too small to regulate her own temperature. She weighed less than a bag of sugar. The doctor said she wouldn't survive the night. Rob tried to focus on her words, but they kept slipping away. They used something called kangaroo care, skin-to-skin contact, direct body heat transfer. It's the most efficient way to warm a hypothermic patient. Understanding broke through the fog. You can't. You'll freeze too. I'm not injured. My core temperature is stable. Yours isn't. You're dying, and this is the only way to save you. Oh! She silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. Then, with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she'd shown when fixing the ether core, she began to work. First, she moved him, carefully, slowly, apologizing with her eyes every time he hissed in pain, to a more sheltered part of the fuselage. Then she constructed a nest of thermal blankets and emergency tarps, layering them to create as much insulation as possible. Then she began to undress. What followed was the most intimate, non-sexual experience of Robert Sterling's life. She removed his outer layers first, the coat, the sweater, the shirt frozen stiff with sweat and melted snow. Each piece of clothing crackled as she pulled it away, frost crystals breaking free. His skin underneath was pale, almost blue in places. Her own clothes followed, practical, efficient, without embarrassment or hesitation. This wasn't about bodies or attraction or any of the complicated things that might have existed between them under different circumstances. This was about survival, pure and simple. She positioned herself against his back, her bare skin against his, and wrapped them both in every thermal blanket and emergency tarp she could find. The warmth was indescribable. Not the warmth of a fire or a hot shower, but something deeper, something primal. The warmth of another human being choosing to share their life force with you, choosing to say with their body, if not their voice, you are not alone. You will not die alone. Her heartbeat against his back was steady, strong, a rhythm that seemed to say stay, stay, stay with every pulse. Rob's shivers returned, a good sign he remembered from that survival manual. But with them came a wave of exhaustion so profound that he couldn't fight it. I'm sorry, he mumbled, not sure what he was apologizing for. Everything, maybe. The company, the sabotage, the crash, the decades of building machines instead of connections. The wife who died asking for him. the sun who stopped calling. He felt her hand move against his chest, and it took him a moment to realize she was signing, tracing letters on his skin with a fingertip. "You are still here." "Barely," he whispered. "THISISNOTFILURE." Her hand moved again, slower this time. "MAY, AMY, DAUG, HT, RSHE, BUA, 1.2 pounds when she was born. The photograph, Rob remembered, in your apartment, the incubator, the SHSURVIV did because of you, because you held her. BECAUSEHELDCR. In the darkness of the crashed plane, surrounded by snow and death, Rob understood something he had never understood before. The most powerful force in the universe wasn't technology or money or influence. It was presence, the simple act of being there, of refusing to let go. Margaret had known that. She'd spent her final years trying to teach him, and he'd been too busy building empires to listen. "Thank you," he said into the darkness. All's hand moved one more time across his chest. SLEEP. LLDUAT. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, gray light was filtering through the broken windows. The wind had died down. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the distinctive thrum of helicopter blades. All was still holding him, her breathing steady against his back. They had made it through the night. The rescue helicopter found them at 9:47 a.m., following the plane's emergency beacon. By then, Rob's leg had been splinted with pieces of the cabin interior. His body temperature had stabilized, and all had managed to establish contact with the outside world using the aircraft's damaged but functional satellite phone. The paramedics who loaded Rob onto the stretcher kept shooting glances at all. The silent woman with blood dried on her forehead and hands rough from labor, who had somehow kept a billionaire CEO alive through an Alaskan night with nothing but thermal blankets and human warmth. "You saved his life," one of them said to her, voice full of awe. She didn't respond, just climbed into the helicopter and took her place at Rob's side. They were transported to a small hospital in Fairbanks, where Rob's leg was properly set and All's forehead wound was cleaned and bandaged. The doctors wanted to keep him for observation, but Rob had other plans. "We need a television," he told All when they were finally alone. "Something with news coverage." She found a waiting room with a mounted screen. The anchor's voice filled the space with measured urgency. "Shares of Ether Dynamics have plunged 12% following reports that CEO Robert Sterling was killed in a plane crash late yesterday. Board Chairman Marcus Thorne has assumed emergency control of the company, announcing plans to accelerate the liquidation of non-essential assets." The screen cut to Marcus himself, standing in front of Ether's Seattle headquarters with an expression of practiced grief. "Robert Sterling was a visionary," Marcus said, his voice heavy with false sorrow. "His loss is a tragedy for this company and for the entire logistics industry. As we move forward, we must honor his legacy by ensuring Ether Dynamics remains strong." Rob's hands clenched on the arms of his wheelchair. "He knew," he said quietly. "He knew about the plane. He orchestrated this." All nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. Rob pulled out his phone and started making calls. His CFO, still loyal, confirmed that Marcus had convened an emergency board meeting for that evening. If the vote went through, Marcus would have complete control of the company before Rob could prove he was still alive. "How long until the meeting?" Rob asked. 6 hours. They're doing a video conference. All the institutional investors will be there. "Can we get to Seattle in time?" A pause. "Not with commercial flights. Maybe if you chartered something. The Alaska airports know my face. Marcus will have people watching." They were trapped. 6 hours to stop a takeover and no way to reach the battlefield. All touched Rob's arm. She was typing on her keyboard. "We don't need to go to them. We need to bring them to us." "What do you mean?" She pointed to the television, where the news was now showing aerial footage of the crash site. "Every news station in the country wants an interview with the billionaire who survived a plane crash. You don't need a boardroom, you need a broadcast." Rob stared at her. "That's insane." She almost smiled. So was fixing a $500 million error in 4 minutes. Sometimes insane is the only option. They left the hospital at 11:30 a.m., against medical advice and over the protests of Dr. Okonkwo, who muttered something about stubborn billionaires as she signed the discharge papers. The motel they found was 12 miles outside Fairbanks, the kind of place that accepted cash and didn't ask questions. "The Midnight Sun Lodge," the faded sign proclaimed, though the L had fallen off years ago, and nobody had bothered to replace it. Their room smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner. The carpet was the color of old coffee stains. The heating unit rattled like a dying animal every time it had cycled on. But it had what they needed: a television with cable, a phone line, and enough distance from the hospital that they couldn't be easily tracked. "We need to contact the local news stations," Rob said, already reaching for his phone. Someone small enough to be hungry, but professional enough to have the equipment for a live broadcast. All was at the window, peering through the grimy curtains. She typed quickly. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Black SUV pulling into the parking lot. 2 men in the front." Rob wheeled himself to the window. The SUV was idling near the entrance, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. As they watched, the driver's door opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out, scanning the motel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. "Security contractors," Rob muttered. "Marcus has people looking for me." "How did they find us?" "Hospital records probably, or the helicopter crew. Money talks, and Marcus has plenty of it." The man in the suit was walking toward the motel office, pulling out what looked like a photograph. "We need to move now." All was already grabbing their few possessions. Rob hauled himself out of the wheelchair, his legs screaming in protest, and reached for the crutches they'd taken from the hospital. "Can you drive?" he asked. She nodded and held up a key. Earlier that morning, she had rented a car from the motel's owner, a rusted Honda Civic that looked like it had survived multiple Alaskan winters through sheer stubbornness. At the time, Rob had questioned the expense. Now he was grateful for her foresight. They slipped out the back door just as the suited man entered the front office. The Civic was parked at the far end of the lot, hidden behind a dumpster that had seen better days. All helped Rob into the passenger seat, then circled to the driver's side. The engine turned over with a cough and a wheeze, but it started. "Go," Rob said, "and don't stop until I tell you." She didn't need to be told twice. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in evasion. All drove with a skill that surprised Rob, threading through traffic, taking unexpected turns, doubling back on their route when the black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror. She drove like someone who had spent years navigating dangerous situations, anticipating problems before they materialized. "Where did you learn to do this?" Rob asked during a brief respite when they'd managed to put some distance between themselves and their pursuers. She typed one-handed while keeping her eyes on the road. "Grew up on a farm, spent my teenage years driving tractors and grain trucks. Learned to handle vehicles in conditions that would make most people crash." "That's not what I meant. The evasion tactics, the situational awareness." A pause, then, "After the fire, after I lost my voice, there were people who didn't want me to testify about the safety violations at the plant. I learned to be careful." "Someone threatened you?" "The company that owned the plant. They sent lawyers first, then other people. I had to disappear." Rob stared at her profile, seeing new layers beneath the quiet exterior. She wasn't just a cleaning lady with genius-level intellect. She was a survivor, someone who had been hunted before and learned to hunt back. "Is that why you have no official records? No bank accounts? No employment history?" "Yes. I became a ghost because it was the only way to stay alive." The SUV appeared again, closer this time, and Rob could see a second vehicle now approaching from a side street. "They're trying to box us in," he said. "I know." All's jaw was set, her hands tight on the wheel. She was calculating distances, angles, possibilities. The same analytical mind that had seen the flaw in the ether core now applied to a very different kind of problem. "Can we outrun them?" "No, but we don't have to." She pointed to something ahead, a cluster of buildings that Rob recognized as the Fairbanks Public Safety Complex. Police station, fire department, and most importantly, the kind of place where 2 black SUVs full of corporate security couldn't follow without drawing attention. "Brilliant," he breathed. "I know." She pulled into the parking lot just as the SUVs reached the intersection behind them. The dark vehicle slowed, hesitated, then continued past. They couldn't risk a confrontation in front of a police station. All parked the Civic and turned to face Rob. Her expression was a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "We need to move fast. They'll find another way to reach us." "The news station?" "Yes, it's 3 blocks from here. Can you make it on crutches?" Rob tested his leg, wincing at the pain. "I'll manage." "Then let's go. We have a company to save." The small television station in Fairbanks was not prepared for what was about to happen. KTVF 11 was a local affiliate with a staff of 30 and a broadcast range that barely covered central Alaska. Their biggest story that year had been a moose that wandered into a shopping mall. Now they had a billionaire CEO and a mute genius offering them the exclusive of a lifetime. "Let me get this straight," said the station manager, a weathered woman named Patricia Chen, who had been in local news for 30 years. "You want to hijack our evening broadcast to expose a corporate conspiracy, and in exchange you're offering us—" "What exactly?" "The story of the decade," Rob said from his wheelchair. "Exclusive access, first interview, and a donation to your station that will keep you funded for the next 5 years. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Why us? You could call CNN, Fox. Any network would kill for this." "Because you're small, because Marcus won't expect it, and because I don't have time to negotiate with corporate legal departments." She studied him for a long moment. Then she looked at All, who was standing slightly behind the wheelchair, her expression unreadable. "Who is she?" "The woman who saved my life, and the one who's going to help me save my company." At 7:58 p.m. Eastern Time, the Ether Dynamics board meeting convened via video conference. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of a table in Seattle, surrounded by lawyers and accountants. Screens around the room that showed the faces of institutional investors, each representing billions of dollars in capital. "Thank you all for joining on such short notice," Marcus began, his voice somber. "As you know, we've suffered a devastating loss. Robert Sterling was the heart of this company, and his death leaves us." The main screen behind him flickered. "What the—" Marcus turned, annoyance breaking through his mask of grief. The feed changed, no longer a corporate logo but a low-budget news studio. And in the center of the frame, battered but very much alive, sat Robert Sterling. "Good evening, Marcus," Rob said, his voice carrying across the conference room speakers. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." The room erupted. Rob had never been comfortable with public speaking. He'd built his empire in server rooms and boardrooms, not in front of cameras. But tonight, with All standing just off camera, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos, he found his voice. "I'm broadcasting from Fairbanks, Alaska," he said, "where I was taken after surviving a plane crash that I believe was deliberately caused. Before I explain how, I need to introduce someone." He gestured, and All stepped into frame. The contrast was striking. Rob in his hospital gown, leg elevated, All in borrowed clothes, the bandage on her forehead a stark white against her pale skin. Neither of them looked like the powerful executives that viewers expected. They looked like survivors. "This woman's name is All Vance," Rob continued. "3 nights ago, she saved Ether Dynamics from a $500 million system failure. She's not an engineer, she's not a programmer. She cleans our floors." Murmurs from the conference room. On the screen showing investor feeds, expressions ranged from skeptical to intrigued. "She's also a PhD in computational physics from MIT or financial aid, and she sees things in code that 20 of my best engineers missed. When I asked her how, she told me the system needed room to breathe." Rob paused. "She was right. And what she found next will change everything you think you know about this company." All raised her hands and began to sign. Rob, having spent the last 6 hours learning enough to translate, followed her movements. His signing was rough, halting, but the effort itself was part of the message. A CEO learning to communicate with a cleaning lady who couldn't speak. The visual was powerful. "The system failures weren't accidents," Rob translated as All signed. "They were deliberate sabotage. Someone planted a backdoor in the routing algorithm, a piece of code that activates when certain conditions are met." On a split screen, documents began to appear. System logs, email records, financial transfers, evidence that All had compiled during their investigation, transmitted to the station via encrypted channels. "The conditions," Rob continued, "were temperature fluctuations in our District 4 data center. Someone cut the cooling budget by exactly $500 a day, knowing it would trigger the backdoor. That someone was Marcus Thorne." The feed cut to the conference room in Seattle. Marcus's face was ashen. "This is absurd," he sputtered, a desperate attempt by a traumatized man to— "We have the authorization records," Rob interrupted, "signed by you. We have the backdoor code, which was uploaded from a terminal, registered to your assistant. And we have testimony from Dr. Heinrich Miller, who realized 6 hours ago that he'd been deliberately given false diagnostic data." More documents on the screen, a timeline of the sabotage, a money trail leading to offshore accounts. A recorded phone call, obtained through legally questionable means but devastating in its clarity, of Marcus discussing the timeline for Sterling's removal. "You tried to destroy my company," Rob said, his voice quiet but caring. "You tried to kill 300 families in District 4 to build server farms on their bones. You tried to kill me." He leaned forward in his wheelchair. "You failed." The room was silent. Then one of the investor screens, representing a pension fund with $800 million in Ether stock, spoke up. "Mr. Thorne, I think you should step away from the table." More voices joined in, a cascade of abandonment. Within minutes, Marcus Thorne was alone at a table, surrounded by lawyers who were already calculating how to distance themselves from their client. Through it all stood at Rob's side, her hands still, her expression calm. She had done what she came to do, but she wasn't finished. The boardroom fell silent as all stepped forward. Everyone had expected Rob to deliver the closing argument, to cement his victory with another round of evidence or accusations. Instead, he wheeled back and gave her the floor. She stood in front of the camera for a long moment, her hands at her sides. The lights were too bright. The room was too quiet. Every investor, every board member, every viewer was waiting to see what the silent woman would do. All raised her hands and began to sign. Her movements were different now, not the clinical efficiency of presenting evidence, but something deeper, something personal. Rob translated, his voice cracking with emotion. "A system is like a family, he said, following her hands. If one part grows cold, the whole body freezes." She continued signing, her eyes fixed on the camera as if she could see through it to every person watching. "You searched for errors in the code, but the error was in the intent. You built machines to move products across continents. You forgot that the people who build those machines, who clean your floors, who live in the neighborhoods you demolish, are also part of the system. District 4 is not just a location on a map. It is 300 families. It is children who walk to school past the servers that route your shipping. It is grandmothers who remember when the steel mills were the heart of this city. When you cut the cooling budget, you didn't just damage hardware. You told those families that their comfort was worth less than $500 a day. That is the real error, not a misplaced variable, not a timestamp discrepancy. The belief that some people are invisible." She paused, her hands still. Then for the first time in 4 years, Alar Vance opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was barely a whisper. Rough, broken. A voice that had been silent for so long that it no longer remembered how to shape words. But the word was clear. "See us." The camera held on her face. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but her eyes were bright with something that looked like defiance. Rob reached out and took her hand. "See us," he repeated. "That's the message. Not just for Ether Dynamics, for every company that treats people like line items on a budget, for every system that values efficiency over humanity." He turned back to the camera. "Effective immediately, I am canceling the District 4 demolition. The server farm will be relocated to a site that doesn't require displacing families. Additionally, I'm announcing the creation of the Vance Initiative, a program that will provide housing assistance, job training, and community development for every neighborhood affected by Ether operations." He squeezed All's hand. "And I'm promoting Alar Vance to Chief Technical Officer." 1 month later, the November wind carried the first hints of winter across District 4, but the old neighborhood felt warmer than it had in years. Rob Sterling stood in the community garden that had sprung up in the vacant lot where the server farm was supposed to be built. Around him, children chased each other between raised planting beds. Elderly residents sat on new benches, arguing about baseball and complaining about the weather. The sounds of hammering and sawing came from a nearby building where volunteers were renovating apartments. The spire was visible in the distance, its glass facade reflecting the gray sky. But from this angle, it no longer looked like a monument to corporate power. It looked like what it was, a building full of people trying to do their jobs. "Mr. Sterling." He turned to see a young woman approaching, tablet in hand. His new assistant, a recent graduate from a community college in the area, one of the first hires under the Vance Initiative. "The reporters are asking when you'll be available for the dedication ceremony. Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. She nodded and hurried off. Rob walked through the garden, nodding to residents who recognized him. The fame from the broadcast hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. The story of the cleaning lady who saved $1 billion company had gone viral, spawning think pieces and podcast episodes and at least 3 different documentary proposals. But the woman at the center of it all was nowhere near the cameras. He found all at the edge of the garden, sitting on a bench with a book in her lap. She wore a simple coat over her new clothes, professional but understated, nothing like the oversized uniform she'd hidden in for years. "Ready?" he asked, signing the question as he spoke. She closed the book and stood. Her movements were different now, more open, less guarded. The mask of invisibility was gone, replaced by something quieter but stronger. "I was reading about the new heating system," she typed on her phone. "The engineers are worried about the thermal transfer efficiency, and they're overcomplicating it. The solution is simple. They just need to let the heat flow naturally instead of trying to control every variable." Rob smiled. "Room to breathe." She almost smiled back. They walked together toward the ceremony, past the building where the new server farm was being constructed underground. It was smaller than the original plan, less capacity, less profit margin, but it was integrated with the community in ways the old design never imagined. The waste heat from the servers would warm the apartments above. Local residents had been trained as technicians and security staff. The community center next door would have free internet and job training programs funded by Ether's profits. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. Marcus Thorne was fighting the charges, his lawyers arguing that the evidence had been obtained illegally. The board was still full of people who cared more about quarterly earnings than community impact, and all still had nightmares about the fire, about the long years of silence, about everything she'd lost. But they were building something together. At the edge of the ceremony space, Rob stopped. The reporters were gathered, cameras ready. The moment they stepped into frame, the questions would start. "I never asked you," he said quietly. "Why did you do it? That first night when you fixed the system, you could have walked away. No one would have known." All was silent for a moment. Then she lifted her phone. "My daughter's medicine comes through your supply chain. So does the formula for the baby in apartment 3B. So do the dialysis supplies for Mr. Chen down the hall." She looked at him. "I fixed the system because systems matter. Because when they break, people get hurt. And because someone had to." Rob nodded slowly. "And now? Now I'm not invisible anymore, which means I have to keep fixing things, not because no one's watching, but because everyone is." She put away her phone and straightened her coat. Then together they walked into the light. The camera caught them side by side, the CEO and the former cleaning lady, the billionaire and the woman who had saved him. Behind them, the community garden was bright with late autumn color. Above them, the sky was beginning to clear. Mr. Sterling, is it true you're planning to expand the Vance initiative to other cities?" "Miss Vance, will you be speaking at the conference next month?" Rob raised his hand for silence. But before he could speak, all stepped forward. She was carrying a small wireless microphone, the kind reporters used for interviews. She held it up to her mouth, and when she spoke, her voice was still rough, still damaged, but stronger than it had been a month ago. "I spent 4 years of being invisible," she said. The words came slowly but clearly. "I learned that invisible people see things others miss. The dust in the corners, the cracks in the foundation, the small problems that become big disasters." She looked out at the crowd, reporters, residents, investors, skeptics. "Ether Dynamics doesn't need a voice like mine. It needs 1,000 voices like mine. People who clean the floors and fix the pipes and keep the world running while everyone else is too busy to notice." She turned to Rob. "We're not building a company, we're building a community. And communities don't have CEOs or CTOs, they have neighbors." Rob smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I was going to save this for the official ceremony," he said, "but I think now is better." He opened the box. Inside was a scarf, simple, warm, the kind that would keep out an Alaskan winter. "To keep you warm," he said, signing the words as he spoke. All's eyes filled with tears. She took the scarf and wrapped it around her neck. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper but carried across the entire garden, she said, "You too." 1 month after the story aired, the Vance Initiative expanded to 12 cities. All became a keynote speaker at the Global Technology Conference, and her speech, delivered entirely in sign language, was viewed more than 50 million times. Marcus Thorne was sentenced to 15 years in prison for corporate sabotage and endangering critical national infrastructure. District 4 was no longer called the Rust. The residents gave it a new name, the heartbeat, the pulse of the city, where technology and people coexist. And every night as the underground servers released warmth that heated the apartments above, the people who lived there knew that somewhere in the distant skyscraper, a woman was quietly making sure the system kept running. Because some people don't need to be seen to make a difference. They only need to be heard. And that was the moment everything changed. Not because the system was fixed, but because the invisible were finally seen. In the gripping saga of Robert Sterling and All Vance, we uncover a timeless life lesson. That true genius and compassion often hide in the shadows, overlooked by those blinded by status and power. A silent survivor scrubbing floors while harboring a brilliant mind didn't just fix a $500 million glitch. She mended a broken man in a fractured system, reminding us that invisibility doesn't diminish worth. Her quiet heroism echoes the pain of the unseen, the janitors, caregivers, and everyday warriors whose small acts sustain the world. It stirs a deep emotion, urging us to see beyond titles, to value the nobodies who hold everything together. In a society that celebrates the loud, this tale whispers that empathy and intellect thrive in humility, transforming crises into connections that heal. What hidden hero in your life deserves recognition? Share your heartfelt story in the comments below. It might inspire someone today. If this moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more uplifting journeys of resilience and revelation, and ring the bell to stay connected. Let's honor the unseen together.